The protests in Greenland are not really about tariffs. They are about something much deeper: power, leverage, and how the world reacts when the United States reminds its allies who still sets the tempo. When President Trump threatens tariffs on 8 NATO allies, it sounds economic, but it feels strategic, because tariffs are not just taxes. They are signals, signals that alliances are no longer sentimental. They are transactional. You can hear the confusion in Europe, friends calling this economic warfare, comparisons to Russia creeping into the language. And yet, inside Washington, the message is calm. This is negotiation. Escalate to de-escalate, apply pressure, then deal. That logic has worked before, or at least that's the belief driving it. If you want to understand where this confrontation is really headed, you need to look past the headlines. Stay with me, because what's unfolding here may redefine how power is exercised between allies in the years ahead, and what it means for you, right now and next. Because before we talk about outcomes, we have to clarify the real question at the center of this story. At the center of this moment is not Greenland itself. It is the collision of 3 systems: trade, security, and trust. The White House frames the tariff threat as leverage, a tool to force movement, a way to reopen conversations that have stalled behind diplomacy and procedure. From this view, alliances are not broken, they are being tested. But from Europe's perspective, the picture looks very different. A trade deal celebrated as historic is suddenly unstable, a deal still waiting for approval, a deal tied to hundreds of billions in energy investment and defense commitments, now overshadowed by a broader tariff threat. That uncertainty matters, because institutions move slowly, parliaments hesitate, markets react, and allies begin to question whether agreements are durable or conditional. This is why the backlash is so sharp, not because of tariffs alone, but because they touch the fault line between cooperation and coercion. To understand why this tension keeps repeating, we have to go backward, into history, into cycles, into how economic pressure became a weapon of choice. To understand why tariffs now sit at the center of alliance politics, you have to look at the cycle that produced them. For decades, economic integration was treated as peace insurance. Trade would bind nations, growth would soften conflict, security would follow prosperity. But that model assumed stability, and stability has faded. As globalization matured, power became uneven. Some countries accumulated leverage, others accumulated dependence. The United States watched trade deficits widen, supply chains stretch, strategic assets drift offshore, and gradually economic policy stopped being neutral. It became strategic. Under President Trump, this shift was not subtle. Tariffs were reframed not as protectionism, but as pressure, a way to force renegotiation, a way to expose imbalances that diplomacy had papered over. When allies warned of economic damage, the response was blunt. Growth followed anyway. Markets climbed, confidence returned. That reinforced the belief that confrontation could coexist with prosperity. And once that belief hardens, it gets reused, even against friends, which brings us to the moment when theory collided with reality. And the first real crisis began to form. The first shock came fast, and it came from allies, not rivals. 8 NATO states responded not with quiet diplomacy, but with outrage, symbolic military deployments, public condemnation, language that escalated instead of absorbed pressure. One European voice called it economic warfare. Another warned that no threat would influence decisions on Ukraine or Greenland. That comparison mattered, because once the United States is spoken of in the same breath as coercive powers, something breaks, not legally, psychologically. At the same time, a celebrated trade deal hung in limbo, still unratified, still vulnerable. Members of the European Parliament floated freezing 0% tariffs on U.S. goods. Suddenly, leverage ran both ways. Banks, tech firms, Sanctions whispered aloud. Even inside Washington, uncertainty surfaced. Would these new tariffs stack? What legal authority would be used? No briefing yet, no clarity yet, just pressure. This is the danger point in any negotiation, when escalation stops being controlled. If you're trying to understand how power is really tested, this is the moment to pay attention, because after this, the visible arguments fade and the hidden mechanisms take over. What's happening beneath the surface is not chaos, it is structure, a system built on the assumption that uncertainty itself is leverage. The administration's logic is simple. Predictability benefits the weaker side, ambiguity benefits the stronger one. When tariffs are floated without full legal detail, when timelines are left open, when allies are forced to react before agreements are finalized, the pressure multiplies without a single law being passed. This is negotiation through imbalance. Institutions like the European Parliament depend on clarity. Markets depend on signals. Alliances depend on trust that rules will hold tomorrow. By disrupting that rhythm, the United States forces others to move first, to concede early, or to escalate publicly. Either way, leverage shifts. Even national security arguments follow this logic. Control does not need to be formal. Influence is enough. And when economic security and diplomacy merge, the old categories collapse. This is why tariffs no longer behave like policy tools. They behave like stress tests for alliances, for institutions, for leaders. And once this mechanism is activated, it rarely stops at one confrontation, which is why the next escalation was almost inevitable. The second crisis did not arrive through diplomacy. It arrived through institutions, quietly, inside the United States. Questions surfaced about authority, about legality, about whether these tariffs could survive judicial scrutiny, whether emergency powers could hold, whether the Supreme Court might intervene. Even senior officials admitted they had not yet been briefed. That uncertainty matters, because when power moves faster than process, systems strain. At the same time, another fault line appeared: the Federal Reserve investigation, a leadership transition, senators warning they would block any successor until questions were resolved, independence suddenly under debate, not in theory, but in practice. This is how pressure spreads, from trade to courts to central banks. When economic strategy depends on forceful execution, every institution becomes part of the battlefield, and allies notice, because if domestic guardrails bend, external commitments feel less secure. This is the paradox of leverage politics. Strength generates results, but it also generates friction. And friction, once internalized, eventually reaches ordinary people, which is where this story truly turns. This is where you enter the story, because geopolitics never stays abstract for long. When tariffs shake markets, prices respond. When alliances wobble, confidence weakens. And when confidence weakens, everyday decisions become harder. You hear it in housing, down payments doubling, savings locked behind penalties, retirement accounts turned into last resorts. You're told the economy is booming, yet buying a home feels further away. You're told deals are historic, yet uncertainty keeps rising. This is the quiet cost of leverage politics, not paid by governments, paid by households. When economic tools become weapons, stability becomes collateral damage. And while leaders negotiate in abstract numbers, you calculate in months, rent, mortgage rates, retirement timelines. That tension matters, because public patience is not infinite. If you're trying to make sense of why global power plays suddenly feel personal, you're not alone. Pause for a moment. If this analysis is helping you see the system more clearly, stay with me, because what happens next does not stop at borders. It spreads. What began as a dispute among allies now ripples outward, because when the United States and Europe tense up, the rest of the world recalculates. Markets watch Washington, capitals watch Brussels. Energy flows, investment pauses, words spoken in anger travel faster than policy corrections. If trade agreements can be reopened overnight, no deal feels final. If allies threaten sanctions on banks or technology firms, global supply chains feel exposed. Confidence becomes fragile, and fragility is contagious. This is how localized leverage turns systemic. A tariff here signals a shift there. A protest in Greenland echoes in Asia. A dispute over security assets reframes how middle powers think about alignment. Neutrality suddenly looks safer. Hedging becomes rational. And once that happens, global cooperation thins. Not because anyone wants conflict, but because uncertainty punishes commitment. This is the unintended consequence of power-first strategy. It works best in isolation. The global system is never isolated, which is why the real question is no longer about tariffs or territory. It's about what kind of future this logic produces, and that future can unfold in more than one way. From here, three futures emerge, not predictions, paths. The first is optimistic. Negotiation succeeds. Pressure softens into agreement. Tariffs become temporary. Allies recalibrate without rupture. The message becomes clear. Leverage was used, but restraint prevailed. Trust bends. It does not break. The second path is muddled. Deals stall. Institutions slow everything down. Legal challenges drag on. Allies comply publicly but hedge privately. Cooperation continues, thinner than before. Less faith, more insurance. The system still functions, but it creaks. Then there is the third path, the dangerous one. Escalation hardens into habit. Tariffs normalize. Alliances hollow out. Economic warfare language becomes policy reality. Every negotiation starts with threat. Every deal feels provisional. In that world, strength replaces stability as the organizing principle. It works until it doesn't. History shows this clearly. Systems built on pressure deliver speed, but they sacrifice resilience, and resilience is what sustains power over time. Which brings us to the final question. What do we learn from this moment, and what should you take away from it? This is the moment of reflection. What does all of this really mean for the future? The world we are entering will demand something different from the past. Not just strength, but wisdom in using it. Not just power, but patience to let that power create stability. And right now what we see is a test, not of President Trump's policies, not of the European Union's resolve, but of something deeper. Can power be wielded without sacrificing trust? Can strength be a tool for lasting peace, not just immediate gain? These questions will echo far beyond Greenland, beyond tariffs, beyond this specific confrontation. Because as this drama plays out, we are all learning what the future of power really looks like. This is your moment to think. What kind of world do you want to live in? A world of constant leverage where every deal feels conditional and every ally feels distant, or one where strength is balanced by trust and stability is built on cooperation, not coercion. The choice is clearer than it appears, but it's up to you to decide how we move forward. This is just the beginning. And with that, I leave you with a question. How will you navigate the future? Stay tuned for the next analysis.